I'm Luis Montoya. I'm the project manager of the Oakville Bikeways project, and I lead a team here at the MTA that works on innovative bikeways.
And I'm Salita Reynolds, and I'm the section leader for Livable Streets. And I have 3 teams in my section, and one of them is policy and innovation.
Okay, so you describe the current plans of the Felon Oak Bikeways.
Sure. So we went out to the community in December, right? The last community meeting, and shared a number of different alternatives. And at the time, we had one that removed a travel lane for vehicles, one that removed parking, and one that was sort of a hybrid option where there would be a travel lane during the day that would convert to parking in the evening. And we did some analysis and also heard pretty clearly that the travel lane removal option, while it might be something that we could think about, in the future, is something that would have really far-reaching impacts that would require a lot more extensive work to make kind of functional within the transportation system. And we felt like the parking removal option was one that has significant impacts to the neighbors, and but is something that we could take and move forward in a more timely way. The hybrid option had a lot of technical and engineering challenges with it, and when you really dug down into the details, what you'd be getting with that, it sounds on the face of it as though you're getting the best of both worlds, but what actually ends up happening is that it doesn't really function well for anyone. So for those reasons, we sort of took the travel lane removal and the hybrid option off the table. So our plans now are focused on the option that removes parking to gain the additional space for a bike lane and a buffer between the bike lane and moving traffic. And so that's kind of where we are now, is that we've gone through several rounds of presentations to the Bicycle Advisory Committee, Pedestrian Safety Advisory Committee, the Mayor's Disability Council. We're going to go to the Physical Access Committee and the Paratransit Coordinating Council to gather even more input along the way. And then, Luis, have you also been meeting individually with some business owners?
Yeah, meeting with business owners, residents, really just anybody who wants to get in touch with us about the project.
So the idea is that we get all of this input, and some of different groups are focused around different elements of the design, and then we come up with sort of a preferred or recommended concept design that we take to a public meeting, probably in late March, early April, so that we can share with all the stakeholders, what we heard in terms of their input and what came out of our analysis. And so that's at a kind of high level where the design is focused and where the public process is.
And so you decided not to remove the travel lane because of computer studies, or why did that?
Right, so transportation planners and engineers use a lot of arcane technical software to evaluate how different changes would affect travel patterns on the street, and not just for vehicles, but for bicyclists and pedestrians as well. What would happen in terms of pedestrian crossing distances and pedestrian crossing times, and what would happen in terms of increased congestion on the routes, and what would happen in terms of trips being kind of diverted through the neighborhood. So sometimes we say that traffic is like water. It finds the best way, the fastest way to get from A to B. And when there's congestion on one street, drivers will often divert into neighborhood streets that are not appropriate, and to try and bypass congestion. So we model that in our in software that we have that actually simulates what the conditions would look like, and we look at time of day and time of year kind of information, and then use that to figure out whether or not something looks feasible to us or not.
Okay. And so it was found that there would be too much congestion.
It's the congestion and the spillover traffic.
Yeah.
And, the congestion causes spillover traffic, and the spillover is going to go on residential streets that aren't designed to hold large volumes of traffic, and also streets that carry muni, like haze. So now we're talking about impacts to folks who live on nearby streets and folks who ride muni. And the far-reaching effects is really what we looked at, is that it takes the effects off the corridor and spreads them out throughout a whole neighborhood. And that the trade-offs there just didn't really make sense if there was other options to accommodate the bikeway.
There would be other components of that would be required to help manage those impacts that would be a lot more expensive to implement. It would turn the project from, a bikeway on 3 blocks of street into a much bigger transportation project that would probably require, signalizing certain intersections which aren't signalized right now, signals are very expensive. They're about $250,000 each. And really retiming certain signals, and also potentially even putting in traffic diverters in the neighborhood, and those kinds of improvements tend to be very expensive. So from our perspective, it took, what could be a challenging but doable project and turned it into something much larger in terms of its scope and its cost. And in the interest of getting something out there as quickly as possible, we felt like that wouldn't meet that goal.
How confident are you in these computer simulations? Like, is it possible just to go out there and block off a lane for, say, a day or a week or so to see what the actual effects are?
So you usually need to give drivers at least a month, and more like 6 months, to adjust to major changes like that. So I worked on a project once in the city of Oakland where we were looking at trying to do a road diet on a street, a pretty major arterial street, and we went out and we coned off the outside lanes, and it was just utter and complete chaos. And we tried to do it a couple of days in a row, but because you have people that don't use, when you have a big sort of connector street like Oak and Fell or like the one in Oakland, you have people that use it every day, but you have a lot of people who only use it occasionally. And so when you try and do something on a temporary basis, all of the confusion and additional kind of frustration that comes out of people encountering something new and not having enough time to adjust to it ends up kind of failing the experiment. And so that's why we really try to shy away from doing things that are a day or a week or even, a month long kind of temporary thing. And especially when you get into using temporary materials, then you have things that are unattractive on top of being confusing and frustrating, and they can really bias people around a project. So the people who feel like it wasn't ever going to work are really validated. The people who think it could work want us to give it more time, and in the meantime the neighbors are frustrated with something in front of their house that is unattractive and inconvenient for them to deal with. So we try not to do experiments like that on big streets.
And so do you know what the nature of the buffer will be?
So right now we're looking at a minimum, a painted buffer like you see on some parts of Market Street. It could also have some of the potentially some kind of physical separation like the safe hit posts that you also see on the bike lane on Market Street. But there are some locations where we think it might be possible to do something even more sort of aesthetically pleasing than that. So, actually having a raised median with some kind of planting or greening in it in certain sections of the 3-block stretch where we really don't see where there aren't a lot of driveways, so there's not a lot of need to get across, that there could be an opportunity to bring in some of those kinds of elements. So it's sort of, at a minimum it will be paint, the next step up would be the safe hit posts, and then the next step up after that would be some kind of median with some planters in it. Is that fair to say?
Okay. So can you explain the timeline of the project from like the installation of the green bike lanes and left turn lane on Fell Street and up to the plans to install the protected bikeway?
Sure. So I'll start, and then Luis, you can add. I think the bike lane on Fell Street has been there since 2002 or something like that. It's been there for quite a long time. We
Do you know the history of that?
Fell was probably already a pretty popular place to ride bikes because it's the flattest, most direct route between the Wiggle and the Panhandle. So cyclists are naturally drawn there. And despite the high levels of traffic and close proximity to traffic that the cyclists were enduring, they were still riding there. And I think that we recognized that, and we found a way to accommodate them by removing what was a towaway lane in the evening in order to install the bike lane.
I think actually somebody painted the bike lane.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know. Yeah.
could be.
Yeah.
So then we decided to turn it green at the end of 2010, I think.
Yeah, it was 2010. It was right around the time we started experimenting with green on Market Street.
And the original idea around using green was that you should use it at conflict points. So different cities use it in different ways. Some cities drop the green at the conflict points. Other cities introduce it at conflict points. But the way that color was originally used in Vancouver, BC, and Portland, Oregon was at conflict points. So at on-ramps and access points to bridges and so on. And so I imagine that, that is one of the most well-known and highly visible conflict points in the whole city for bicyclists and drivers and pedestrians. And so it was probably a natural place to use green. Everything that we do in Livable Streets has to be funded usually by a grant or oftentimes by Prop K. And so we have to queue up a request for those funds, and that takes usually about 4 months, 3 to 4 months, from the moment that you have a twinkle in your eye that you want the money till when you actually book it and can start charging your time to it is about a 4-month lag. So, end of February, we decide it's a project, then we queue it up for funding, and so that's sort of taken us through the end of last year and then where we are right now.
And how do you determine what projects take priority?
So it's a combination of things. There are projects in the 2009 Bicycle Master Plan that are called near-term projects, and there are, I think, 61 of them. And those are our sort of first priority to make sure that we continue to build out those projects that were identified in that plan. And then...
Do you know why those were identified initially?
It was before my time. I didn't work on the bike plan, but I know that there was a series of community meetings. They did analysis on where people are riding, where collisions are occurring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's typical stuff that you do when you do a bike plan. First, you want to figure out how to take care of the people who are already out there riding, and so you usually look around and get input from people about where the most popular routes are, and then you want to figure out where people would ride if they could or if they felt safer, and that's usually the next sort of tier of projects, and that's usually based on what's the land use like, are there places people want to ride, are there higher density of jobs or housing or things like that, and so that's usually what goes into a bike plan. I can imagine it wasn't.
Yeah, I'm sure it was pretty standard.
Pretty standard here. So, but then we also have a bicycle advisory committee. And we have the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, who are sort of constantly suggesting projects and coming up with ideas. And we take those in, and then we sort of evaluate them against the other work that we're doing, and make some internal judgment calls about how to prioritize things. But I'd say our sort of North Star is really the bike plan.
Mm-hmm. But you also said that since the mayor made this comment, that kind of pushed that project up further.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Fell Street was always part of the near-term bike projects, and so to add Oak and to really look at both of them in greater detail, I would say wasn't too far off base in terms of where our priorities would have been. We have electronic bike counters out on, I think, Fell, and we actually have a modem attached to them that tells us what data it's collecting. We had over 500,000 bicycle trips that were captured from that modem just in 2011, even with what's out there today, which I would describe as pretty incomplete. So I think we would see very clearly a strong demand for improving conditions there, even if the mayor hadn't said anything at all.